The morning started the way every Father's Day in my memory had started, quietly. With coffee. I made myself. I'm not saying that to draw sympathy. I'm saying it because by the time Marcus was 26 years old, I had stopped expecting anything different. The cards had stopped around the time he turned 19. The phone calls, the unprompted ones. The ones where a son calls just to say, "Hey, how are you? Just thinking of you." Those had stopped even earlier. And somewhere along the way, I'd made peace with that. Or told myself I had. My name is Dale Whitmore. I'm 54 years old. I own a landscaping and property management company that I built from nothing. I mean literally nothing. A second-hand truck. A borrowed mower. And 14-hour days that stretched across most of my 30s and 40s. I have a house in Scottsdale that I designed myself. I have a 2019 Porsche Cayenne that I paid for in cash. And until about 9 months ago, I had a son. I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened that day. I loved Marcus with the kind of love that doesn't ask for anything back. The kind that shows up even when it isn't wanted. His mother, Renee, and I divorced when he was 11. It was ugly the way those things often are accusations. Lawyers. Property disputes. But I made a decision early on that none of that ugliness was going to touch my son. I paid every dime of child support on time. I paid for his school trips. His equipment when he played lacrosse in high school. His first car at 16. When he got into Arizona State. I covered tuition, housing, and a monthly allowance that most of his friends envied. I did all of that not because I wanted to be praised for it. I did it because he was my son. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known. Because no one warned me was that money given without boundaries doesn't feel like love to a child. It feels like a substitute. And somewhere in the years between his parents' divorce and his college graduation, Marcus had built a story about me in his head. A story where I was the villain. Where every check I wrote was a way of buying off my guilt. Where every gift was a transaction. Where I hadn't been a father, I'd been a bank account with a face. I only understood that fully on Father's Day. He called me 3 days before to say he wanted to come by. That alone surprised me. Marcus and I had been on thin ice for most of that year. There had been an argument in February about money. He'd asked me to co-sign a loan for a business idea that I had real concerns about. And when I said I needed to see a proper plan first, he accused me of never believing in him. We didn't speak for 6 weeks after that. So when he called and said he wanted to come by on Father's Day, I felt something warm move through my chest. I thought, maybe we were turning a corner. I straightened up the house. I put steaks in the refrigerator to grill. I drove to the store and bought a 6-pack of the craft beer. He liked the kind with the orange label from that small brewery in Tempe because I'd remembered him mentioning it once. Months earlier. That's the thing about fathers. We remember the small things. We hold on to them. He arrived at 11:30 in the morning. He looked tired. He had dark circles under his eyes, and a set to his jaw that I recognized from his teenage years. That particular kind of tension that meant something was coming. We sat in the living room. I offered him coffee. He said no. I asked about his job. He was working at a marketing firm downtown. An entry-level position he'd had for about 7 months. He shrugged. Said it was fine. Said the hours were long. I nodded. I told him I understood. I told him I'd worked long hours too. When I was getting started, he looked at me in a way that made me stop talking. Is that what you call it? He said. Getting started. I told him I wasn't sure what he meant. What came next took about 4 minutes. I know that because I looked at the clock on the wall during it, one of those involuntary things your brain does when it's trying to anchor itself to reality. It was 1147 when he started talking. It was 1151 when he finished. In those 4 minutes, Marcus told me that I had never really been his father. That I had provided money because money was easier than presents. That I'd missed every important moment of his childhood, and when I tried to protest that, when I started to list the games I'd attended, the school events, the weekends, he cut me off and said I was rewriting history to make myself feel better. He said I'd always cared more about my business than about him. He said that growing up, he'd felt like an obligation. A line item. He said that his therapist had helped him understand that our relationship had caused him real psychological harm. And then, and this is the part I've replayed more times than I can count, he looked me directly in the eyes and said, "Honestly, Dad, I wish you'd never been my father." The room was completely quiet after that. I sat very still for what felt like a long time. My coffee was on the table in front of me. I looked at it. I thought, in a strangely calm way, about how I'd bought this house, about the first winter I'd run the landscaping business, when I'd had to take a second job doing overnight security shifts to cover payroll for 2 employees I couldn't afford to lose, about the night before Marcus's high school graduation, when I'd driven 4 hours round trip to pick up the watch I'd had engraved for him because the jeweler had called to say it was ready and I wanted him to have it the next morning. I thought about all of it very quickly, the way you sometimes see your whole life in a single flash. Then I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I want to be clear about that. I did not shout. I did not curse. I did not say anything cruel or cutting. I simply stood up, and I looked at my son, and I said, "All right, then live as though you never had one." I picked up my keys from the counter by the door. I walked to the garage. I got in the Porsche, and I drove away. I want to describe what it felt like to drive away from that house, because I think it matters. I wasn't crying. I thought I would be. I'm not a man who is afraid of emotion. And there had been moments in my life, private moments, where I had cried over Marcus, over the distance between us, over the things I hadn't known how to give him that apparently he had needed. But in those minutes, driving down the street away from my own home, with the Arizona sun coming through the windshield and the radio off, I felt something that wasn't grief. Or it wasn't only grief. It was also, in some way I didn't fully understand yet, relief. When you have been holding your breath for years, waiting for a door to open, sometimes it is a mercy to finally hear it close. I drove for about 40 minutes without any particular destination. I went out toward the edge of the city where the landscape opens up and you can see the mountains. And I parked on a pullout overlooking a dry riverbed, and I sat there for a while with the engine off. My phone buzzed. I assumed it was Marcus. I assumed it was an apology. Or more likely a continuation of the argument. Or maybe just silence in the form of a thumbs down emoji. I picked it up. It was a text from Marcus. It said, "Bring my car back or I'm calling the cops." I read it twice. I want to make sure you understand what I was reading. I had driven away from my own house, in my own car, a vehicle I had purchased with my own money, registered in my own name, insured under my own policy. I had the title. I had every document. There was not a single legal or factual sense in which that car belonged to Marcus, had ever belonged to Marcus, or had been promised to Marcus. But there it was. Bring my car back, or I'm calling the cops. I put the phone down on the passenger seat and looked out at the dry riverbed for another minute or so. Then I picked the phone back up and typed one sentence. "It isn't your car." 3 minutes later, he called. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message. I still have it, in which he told me I was being childish, that I knew he needed that car, that I had basically promised it to him when I got it, and that if I didn't come back in the next 30 minutes he was reporting it stolen. I want to be careful here, because I know how this sounds. I know there are people who will hear this and immediately start calculating fault on both sides, wondering what I did to make my son feel this way, wondering what I'm leaving out. And the honest answer is probably more than one thing. I wasn't a perfect father. I made choices, especially in the years right after the divorce. that I would make differently now. I prioritized the business during a window when maybe I shouldn't have. I was conflict avoidant in ways that left things unsaid for too long. I own all of that, but I had also shown up consistently for 26 years. I had not been absent. I had not been cruel. I had not abandoned him. I had loved him without condition, and I had demonstrated that love in every tangible way I knew how. And on Father's Day, sitting in my own living room, he had told me he wished I had never existed in his life. He called the police, the officer who showed up at my house because I had driven back by then. Slowly, deliberately, to let this unfold on my own terms was a young man, maybe late 20s, with the kind of expression that told me he had seen this type of call before and was not particularly surprised by it. His name was Officer Trainer. He was professional and polite. He asked me to confirm ownership of the vehicle. I walked him to the garage. I pulled out the title, the registration, my insurance card, everything in my name, everything in order. He looked at the documents. He looked at the car. He looked at Marcus, who was standing in my driveway with his arms crossed, and an expression I can only describe as the face of a man who has made a significant miscalculation, but is not yet ready to admit it. Officer Trainer handed me back my documents and turned to Marcus. "Sir," he said, "this vehicle belongs to your father. There's nothing I can do here." Marcus said something about an implied agreement, about how I had told him years ago the car would eventually be his. Officer Trainer nodded patiently and explained the difference between a verbal implication and a legal title. Marcus looked at me then, and for the first time that day, I saw something on his face that wasn't contempt or anger. It was something closer to embarrassment. I thanked Officer Trainer. He left. Marcus and I stood in my driveway in the Scottsdale heat for a moment that stretched in a way that felt geological, slow, and enormous. He said, "This isn't over." I said, "I know." And then I went inside. What I haven't told you yet is what came after. Because in some ways, that afternoon in the driveway is the easiest part of this story to tell. The harder part is the weeks that followed, the way that day cracked something open that couldn't be sealed again. And what I found inside the crack. My sister, Karen, called me that night. Marcus had apparently called his mother, who had called Karen. And by evening there was a full relay of family communication happening of which I was the subject and not the participant. Karen, who has always been on my side in a way that sometimes makes me uneasy. Because I don't entirely trust loyalty that costs nothing, called to tell me that I had humiliated Marcus in front of a police officer and that I needed to apologize. I told her what had happened, start to finish. There was a silence on her end of the line that I found instructive. She said, "He really said that on Father's Day?" I told her yes. She said, "Dale, that's..." And then she didn't finish the sentence, which told me everything I needed to know about where the truth sat. I talked to my attorney 3 days later. Not because I was planning anything litigious, there was nothing to litigate, but because I needed to hear from someone calm and detached about what my actual obligations were going forward. The answer was straightforward. Marcus was 26. He was employed. He had no legal claim on my assets, my vehicles, or my ongoing financial support. My lawyer, a measured woman named Patricia Osei, told me that I was under no obligation to continue any financial assistance, and that in her professional opinion, I might want to think carefully about what continued assistance would actually communicate. I thought about it. I thought about it for a long time. In the end, I did not cut Marcus off immediately. I did not make a dramatic announcement. I did not send a letter or have my lawyer draft something official. I simply stopped. The monthly transfers I had been sending, and I'll be transparent here, they averaged around $2,000 a month, ostensibly to help with rent and expenses. Though Marcus was employed and probably didn't need them the way I had been telling myself he did, they stopped. Quietly, the way they had begun years ago, when I just started slipping money into his account because it felt like a way to stay connected. He noticed after the first month. He sent me a text asking if there'd been an error with the bank. I called him. It was the first time we'd spoken since Father's Day. I told him there was no error. I told him I had been thinking, and that I believed we both needed some time to figure out what, if anything, our relationship was built on beyond financial transactions. I told him that I loved him. I told him that would never change. And I told him that the door was open to real conversation, real honesty, real effort from both of us, but that I could no longer fund an arrangement that had come to define me. In his eyes, as an ATM with a guilt complex, he hung up. He called back 45 minutes later and we talked for 2 hours. It was the longest real conversation we had had in years. It was not easy. There were long silences, and there were moments where one or both of us was barely holding it together. He said things that were honest and painful. I said things that I had needed to say for years. There were no apologies that night, not proper ones. Not yet, but there was something more valuable than apologies. There was the first real attempt, in longer than I can remember, to actually see each other. I'm not going to tell you that everything is fixed. I'm not going to wrap this up with a tidy reconciliation and a lesson about the importance of communication. Life doesn't do that. What I will tell you is this: Marcus and I are talking carefully, slowly, with a lot of starts and stops and silences that last too long. His therapist, it turns out, had encouraged him to tell me how he felt. And Marcus had taken that instruction without fully understanding that honesty without care is just cruelty with good intentions. He said that himself. Actually, about 6 weeks after Father's Day. It was the most self-aware thing I'd heard him say in years. And something shifted in me when he said it. We met for lunch last month at a diner in Mesa. Just the two of us. And we sat across from each other like two men trying to find the shared language of something they used to know by heart. He did not apologize in so many words. I did not demand that he did. But at the end of the meal, when we were standing in the parking lot in the late afternoon heat and trying to figure out how to say goodbye, he put his hand on my shoulder briefly and said, "I don't actually wish that." What I said? "I don't actually wish that." I nodded. I told him I knew. I drove home with the windows down and the sun going behind the mountains, and something in my chest that I don't have a clean word for. Not happiness exactly. And not peace exactly. But something in the neighborhood of both. Something that felt, for the first time in a long time, like an honest beginning. Sometimes the most courageous thing a father can do is refuse to disappear. Not because he is owed a relationship, not because he earned one, but because he believes, despite all evidence, that the person standing across from him is still capable of becoming someone worth knowing. I still believe that about Marcus. I suspect I always will.